The Renaissance, Ricoeur argues, was the moment in history when the plurivocal nature of truth revealed itself. He overlooked the work of Aristotle in this judgment, in particular Aristotle's claim that being has many meanings. The period of the Renaissance can of course be conceived of narrowly, or more widely, either as the era between the medieval period and the modern period that can be dated with the fall of Rome in 1527, or the work of Descartes over a century later, 1637. Adrian Stokes, a psychoanalytically inspired art critic, wrote about Renaissance art from the perspective of a genre he named Quattrocento art, a genre he characterized in terms of forms that emanated from the building and walls of the mother of the arts, namely architecture, which could also encase sculptures and paintings. For Stokes, a key term for the effect of art was emblematic, a concept which captured the essence of a process that converted the subjective into something objective. In this process, an expression resulted in an external material object produced with the intention of being responded to and in the spirit of a humanistic telos manifesting humanistic ideas. Renaissance art therefore did strive for a unity of the human world via its intentions and technically produced objects, and it did this as part of a wider project of restoring the classical values of ancient Greece that had been temporarily occluded by the engineering/military spirit of the Roman world. For Stokes, there was a kinship between the mass effect of stone, the blossoming of wall emblems, the sublimated depressive anxiety of the naked Michelangelo figures guarding the Medici tomb, and the look of alerted resignation on the face of the Michelangelo Delphic oracle in the Sistine Chapel. This is the kinship of ideas, but it is also expressive of the objective humanism that we can find in the hurly-burly of the cosmopolitan Shakespeare plays. This spirit was repressed by Descartes' essentially private meditations and discourses in front of a northern fireside in a study far from the agora of the ancient Greeks and the madding Shakespearean crowds, a study that was home to the mathematician's paper and pencil. In the work of Descartes, technical solutions to technical problems such as designing weapons for the battlefield displaced the concerns of episteme, Dyke, Archie, and the concerns of the great-souled men of ancient Greece. In the Cartesian coordinate system, lifeforms moved mechanically in space and time, but consciousness lived a life of its own in the Cartesian account of the cogito, a life embedded in the mechanical brain. This modern variation on Platonic dualism has deliberately distanced itself from Aristotelian hylomorphism and its thesis of the continuity of human lifeforms with animal forms of life, a continuity regulated by the principles of whch. Descartes led the Renaissance revival of the classical spirit right back into the dark labyrinth of the Dark Ages, resting his final case on theology and the argument that only God can guarantee that our life is not a dream we will soon awaken from. It is not clear what Ricoeur means with the phase, pluralistic nature of truth, but the resemblances of his phenomenological position to that of Descartes are clear. This, together with a clearly articulated anti-rationalist sentiment, which rejects the first principles of Aristotelian and Kantian philosophy, leads one to the judgment that we are dealing with a modern theory of man that also rests its final arguments on theological grounds. According to Ricoeur, all attempts to search for the unity of being is a temptation and an evil that ought to be avoided. This may be a reference to a view that medieval clerics and scholars have held, namely God is one, and this judgment often occurs in relation to a discussion of the Holy Trinity of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. If this is the case, then the judgment that this kind of attempt to unify different aspects of the divine must be something to avoid, but it is not clear why. The Kantian view of God is not essentially an epistemological or ontological view, and it is not therefore similar to the Cartesian view in which the idea of God theoretically guarantees that our experiences are real and not the figment of a dream. Rather, it is the practical/politically/ethically rational idea of freedom that Kant focuses upon in order to support the hypothetical judgment. If you lead a worthy life, then the life one leads will be a flourishing life. Ricoeur would counter such reflections with the claim that rationality is only present in man's life in the form of a wish for reason, and he would further claim that this is both a fact and a flawed response to the fundamental ambiguity of existence. This wish for reason is furthermore characterized as a lie, but Ricoeur never engages directly with the arguments of Kant and prefers to keep a respectable distance to critical philosophy insofar as the concepts of freedom and responsibility, and their connection, are concerned. Kant's view of truth in his first critique is essentially a formal account and insists upon acknowledging the impossibility of a general definition of truth. He agrees that there must be a formal agreement of knowledge and its object, but points out that objects concretely differ from one another, and that consequently any definition will lack this important material component. This position also testifies to the hylomorphic character of Kantian reflections, which demands a relation between form and matter that will be in accordance with the principles of explanation/justification, which one will find are implied by the definition of knowledge that both Kant and Aristotle accept, namely, justified true belief. The two principles of non-contradiction and sufficient reason together constitute the archi of Kantian metaphysical reasoning. Insofar as we do concern ourselves with the content of our knowledge claims, its objects, the categories of the understanding would indeed appear to be pluralistic and partly constitutive of the ontological structure of the different objects we confront in reality. Here, too, we find Kant using hylomorphic reasoning and designating the content of knowledge as its matter, which on hylomorphic theory is organized by forms, justifying principles, laws. Truth, therefore, also has a form, which relates to the principle of non-contradiction that Kant claims must be regarded as a negative criterion for truth. The matter of knowledge, on the other hand, is firmly situated in a context of discovery/exploration whose purpose it is to acquire information. Logic, on this account, teaches us nothing about the content of knowledge. Rather, it is the faculty of sensibility, combining a priori and empirical intuitions, that constitutes the material awaiting possible conceptualization in terms of the categories of the understanding. Kant, we know, insisted that intuitions without concepts are blind and concepts without intuitions are empty, thereby drawing attention to the importance of both these elements of experience. General logic cannot be used at this level without the risk of falling into what Kant called dialectical illusion. Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Trans Kemp Smith, N. London, Macmillan, 1963, p.99. The categories of the understanding, on the other hand, do concern themselves with what Kant termed special logic, and the special principle of sufficient reason which is connected to the ontological structure of the categories. Kant also refers to the logic associated with this aspect of knowledge as transcendental logic, which is specifically concerned with confining judgment within the scope and limits of experience. Here, too, Kant warns us against generalizing or using the categories outside these limits for fear of falling into illusion. Whether or not one can regard the above Kantian view as a philosophical development of the Renaissance revelation of the pluralistic nature of truth remains an open question. One possible answer to this question consists in acknowledging the hylomorphic or Aristotelian influence in Kant's work, which carries with it a commitment both to the definition of knowledge as justified true belief. Aristotle begins his metaphysics with a statement that we all desire to know, as well as a metaphysical commitment to the many meanings of being. In the light of this answer, it could be argued that if Kant is a hylomorphic philosopher, this would in its turn constitute an elaboration upon the Renaissance aim of restoring the classical humanistic spirit of ancient Greece. The special innovation of Kant was to consolidate the home for philosophy as a subject, namely in a university system that was at the same time operating on a principle of specialization, probably on the model of the guild system. One important point to make in this context is that in the works of Aristotle and Kant, reason is not merely a wish, but rather a faculty which, together with the faculty of understanding, performs a regulative function with respect to the desire in general and wishing in particular. Desire and wish in the case of both Aristotle and Kant interact with the imagination. Another important question to ask is related to the extent to which one philosophically conceives of the abiding influence of ancient Greece in our culture, with special reference to Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle, we know, had great respect for his teacher, and this respect was probably to a large extent mutual. Historically, however, probably because of the role of the Church and its preference for the body-soul dualism of Plato, it was Plato that dominated the religious discussion up to that point when philosophy became established in universities during the period extending from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment philosophy of Kant. It should also be recalled that both Aristotle and Kant provided powerful arguments against the dualism and materialism of their times. Both philosophers were rationalists that rejected dialectic in its various forms. Neo-Kantians would, for example, recommend against falling into the temptation of the dialectic approaches, firstly, of Hegel that led later to modern Cartesian phenomenology, and secondly, to the political philosophy of Marx. The Aristotelian and Kantian forms of rationalism both distinguish carefully between, firstly, the metaphysics of ethics, which concerned itself with action and its relation to the good, and secondly, the metaphysics of nature, which principally concerns itself with material change and the events bringing about such change. The being of the actor and his actions belonged namely in a different universe of discourse to the material being of changing substances which retain their ontological identity throughout change. Ricoeur surprisingly claims in his essay entitled Truth and Falsehood, page 167, that the best-known truth activity is to be found in the domain of empirical science, a realm in which mathematics plays a decisive role in the objectivizing of our perceptual experience. It was truth activity in this realm, Ricoeur argues, that brought about the dissolution of what he calls the philosophico-theological synthesis. The method of verification and its relation to the facts is what was regarded as significant for theory building in this realm of truth activity. The laboratory and its instruments, for example, e.g. the Wilson cloud chamber, become in this activity cultural objects with a particular cultural meaning. Ricoeur invokes the idea of unity again in this discussion and claims that different sciences will specialize in different regions of being, and any attempt to find unity in a universal conception of science is problematic. Nevertheless, it is science, and not reason and the understanding which for Ricoeur is the touchstone of truth, page 170. This modern conception of science, argues Ricoeur, calls into question the Greek conception of episteme, and the discovery of atomic energy is mentioned in the context of this discussion. Science recategorizes man in this conquest, and man becomes just another substance in a category of things. This view returns us to those eras in our history when dualistic and materialistic presuppositions re-emerge in the philosophical landscape, a view which will eventually lead to Hannah Arendt's conception of humanity as being partly constituted by the new men for whom everything is possible. Scientific truth, for Ricoeur, has a dialectical character and is related to a circle of perceiving, knowing and acting, page 172. Somehow, in some obscure fashion, on this account, ethical choices begin to form in relation to the historical choices we have made over time as part of an endless questioning of the grounds of our ethical commitments and subsequent action. Part of this questioning occurs in aesthetic contexts when the artist uses imagination to both create something new and to criticize life and perhaps the world as a whole. Ricoeur claims that if the artist is searching for unity, this unity is a lie and merely a wished-for entity that uses the authority of the artist violently. In true dialectical fashion, Ricoeur then also admits that the unity of reason and life is a possibility as long as one does not attempt to tie them together too soon. Page 176. This is a variation of a criticism Ricoeur makes of the ontological phenomenology of Heidegger, a philosopher he admires. Ricoeur provides us with his own solution to the problem of unity by reference to those theological truths that are revelatory of a person. This person is characterized in the truths of the scriptures, and it is these truths that preachers attempt to communicate in their sermons. Of course, we are reminded that the authority of theology is also violent in its essence. The above concentration on the particular life of a particular person, opposes the program of philosophy whose view of unity is in terms of universal understanding. Ricoeur does insist, however, that the Word of God is a good authority. What Ricoeur calls the pathos of authority does not, however, integrate easily with what he calls the pathos of freedom, which insofar as the theologian is concerned, it is claimed, is tinged with an anti-authoritative arrogance. Insofar as Kant's critical philosophy aims at an integral humanism, it falls into the realm of the illusory. Yet we find here no mention of Kant's political philosophy, which Kant presents as a discipline with ethical foundations, which as a matter of fact he regards as a more encompassing discipline than theoretical theology insofar as our life is concerned. Ethics, for Kant, is founded upon capacities for judgment and choice that are based on a liberal conception of freedom, which amongst other things, is a freedom from the influence of a violent subjugating authority, and a freedom which in Enlightenment spirit dares to use reason. Ricoeur prefers to discuss Marxism, one of the sources of 20th century totalitarianism. He praises Marxism for being the philosophy of history par excellence, presumably because it embodied a rejection of the authority of a master class, the bourgeoisie, and also because it incorporated a defense of the subjugated class, the proletariat. Marx's mapping of this historical relation between these two classes in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis ignored the political philosophy of Kant, which in fact inherited the Aristotelian vision of the importance of a middle class that embraces the most important values of the oligarchs and democrats who were dividing the city with their disputes and conflicts during the times of Plato and Aristotle. Marxism, we know, arbitrarily sided with the proletariat class on predominantly economic grounds that did not take into consideration the idea of justice as conceived of by Aristotle or the idea of freedom as conceived of by Kant. Ricoeur then claims startlingly, on page 185, that only Marxism can provide us with what he terms a rational politics. Unity for Ricoeur clearly has a theological eschatological character that does not have the resources to adequately conceptualize the middle ground of Aristotelian politics. A middle ground which embodies the abiding values of oligarchy and democracy and rejects the injustices, inequalities and failures of these classes to respect the categorical law of treating everyone as ends in themselves. One would have expected any eschatological hope for an integrated history to, at the very least, incorporate these class-transcendent values. Instead, we are invited to interpret this eschatological hope in terms of a judgment day or last day which presumably will bring history to a close with a day of truth in the person of Jesus Christ. This account describes De Civitate Dei as a very different city to De Civitate Tirana, perhaps because it is Babylon rather than Athens that serves as the model of the earthly city. St. Augustine's tale is indeed a tale of the two cities of Babylon and Jerusalem, but perhaps the more interesting tale would be that which examines the relations between Athens and Jerusalem, between the many meanings of being and the monotheistic total authority of God, who presumably gave us the freedom to build our cities rather than while away our time in a Garden of Eden. In a short essay aiming at clarifying the issue of unity, page 192, Ricoeur claims that our relation to unity is also related to wish fulfillment and that the truth cannot both be one and plural at the same time. The Aristotelian principle of non-contradiction claims that the same time must be qualified by, and in the same respect, which leaves the door open for the idea of the truth having different aspects. Ricoeur further claims that there cannot be any intuition of this unity because our relation to the world is a relation to that which is the most concrete horizon of our existence and toward which we can have a multitude of different attitudes. Pages 192-3. It is the power of perception which explains the necessity for remaining at the concrete level of the experienced life world, which is the source of all my acts, attitudes, cultural expectations and commitments. This life world is then transformed into the word, logos, which cannot grasp the elusiveness of a unity that is the horizon for everything experienced. The unity of the life world, according to Ricoeur, is too prior to be possessed and too lived to be known. Page 194. In living all his attitudes, man is forced to suffer the plurality of all his objects. Page 194. The preferred form of unity for Ricoeur is what he calls eschatological unity. This unity for the Christian is, of course, tied up with his lived faith. In this unity, the charity of Christ, which is the hidden meaning of all human experience, will reveal itself on the last judgment day, and the truth will be revealed.